The sun had begun its languid descent over the kingdom of Valenwood, staining the castle's towering spires in hues of amber and blood red. The air was thick with the quiet anticipation of New Year's Eve, a time meant for revelry and reflection. But the usual festivity was overshadowed by an unexpected guest. A raven, its feathers blacker than midnight, perched upon the throne room's latticed window. Princess Lyra was the first to notice it. She had been tracing the fading sunlight with her gaze, lost in thoughts of her impending union with Prince Caden, when the creature's shadow rippled across the chamber like spilled ink. The court grew hushed as the raven let out a guttural caw and released a scroll from its claws. It fell to the ground with a resonant thud, the kind that seemed to echo through time itself. "An omen," whispered the chamberlain, his voice trembling. "No," Lyra corrected, her tone steady, but her fingers tingling with unease. "A message." She rose, her emerald gown trailing behind her, and approached the scroll. The wax seal, a deep crimson stamped with the silhouette of a gnarled tree, seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. With a decisive motion, Lyra broke the seal. The room held its breath. "To the Princess of Valenwood and her destined prince," she read aloud, her voice unwavering. "On this eve of turning time, you are cordially invited to the Witch of Eldergloom's midnight feast. Partake in the feast, and you may grasp powers beyond mortal comprehension. Decline, and the stars themselves may mourn your choice. But beware, the feast carries a price, and the unworthy shall find only ruin." The words danced on the parchment, rearranging themselves into a rhyming couplet that only Lyra could see. "At the stroke of midnight, your fate shall be sealed, where shadows dine and truths are revealed." Lyra's breath hitched. She turned the scroll toward the court, but the letters had dissolved into meaningless squiggles. Only Prince Caden, standing at her side, caught her expression of muted alarm. "What does it mean?" he asked, his dark eyes searching hers. "It means," Lyra replied, her voice softer now, "that we are expected." The royal council convened within the hour, their voices rising in a cacophony of arguments and warnings. The Witch of Eldergloom was a figure of legend, spoken of in hushed tones, her name a byword for both terror and temptation. None could agree on what to make of her invitation. "It is a trap," declared Sir Alden, the aging knight whose scars bore witness to battles against forces unseen. "No good has ever come from dealings with her ilk." "And yet," interjected the court mage, her staff aglow with sapphire light, "the prophecy foretold this. On the year of the celestial alignment, the princess must face a trial of shadows to save the kingdom. Could this be it?" Lyra sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The prophecy had been a ghostly whisper in her life since she was a child, spoken by a traveling seer who vanished as quickly as she had appeared. When the stars converge, the seer had said. You must walk a path of darkness to preserve the light. She had dismissed it as a child's tale, until now. I will go, Lyra announced, her voice cutting through the noise. The council turned to her, stunned. Absolutely not, Sir Alden retorted. It is too dangerous. It is my duty, Lyra said firmly, her emerald eyes blazing with conviction. If this is the trial foretold, then I cannot shirk it, and I will not go alone. She turned to Caden, her partner in destiny as much as in politics. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the storm brewing in his mind. I will go with you, he said after a beat. Whatever the risk, I will not let you face it alone. As the final rays of sunlight bled into darkness, the raven returned. It perched silently on the windowsill, as if waiting. Lyra and Caden, dressed in travelling cloaks of deep green and obsidian, stepped forward. The bird let out another cry and took flight, leading them toward the edge of the forest, where the shadows whispered secrets only they could hear. Behind them, the castle grew dim, its torches extinguished one by one, as if the very night sought to claim it. Ahead, the woods of Eldergloom loomed, a labyrinth of twisted trees and flickering lights that seemed to breathe with an ancient, unseen force. As they crossed the threshold, the air grew colder. The trees leaned closer, their branches forming archways that seemed to murmur in forgotten tongues. Lyra gripped Caden's hand tightly. This is where the feast begins, she whispered. The raven cawed one final time and vanished into the night, leaving them to face the shadows alone. The forest path twisted endlessly, an unnatural labyrinth that seemed alive with malice. The only light came from the faint glow of fungi clinging to gnarled roots, and the occasional glimmer of distant stars peeking through the canopy. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left to decay. Ahead, an unnatural radiance burst through the trees. A mansion stood in defiance of the wilderness, its structure twisted as though it had been grown rather than built. Vines as thick as ropes coiled around its blackened spires, their veins pulsing with an eerie greenish glow. Windows flickered with golden light, and faint laughter, soft, melodic, and chilling, floated from within. This is it, Lyra whispered, her breath misting in the cold air. Prince Caden gripped the hilt of his sword, his jaw set tight. If this is the trial, we face it together. As they approached, the heavy oak doors creaked open of their own accord, revealing a grand hall illuminated by floating orbs of light. The witch awaited them. She sat at the head of an impossibly long dining table, her form a shifting amalgamation of shadow and flame. Her face, when it resolved from the haze, was disconcertingly human, pale, ageless and beautiful in a way that made the eyes ache. Her lips curved into a smile that promised secrets best left untold. Welcome, honoured guests, the witch purred, her voice as smooth as silk and as cold as frost. "I have prepared a feast most rare for this auspicious night. Come, sit, and let us see what the stars have in store." Lyra and Caden exchanged wary glances before stepping forward. The table was laden with dishes that defied logic. A soup that shimmered like molten gold. A tart so crimson it seemed to bleed, and pastries dusted with a silver powder that glowed faintly in the dim light. Each dish exuded a subtle hum, as though alive. The witch gestured with a hand wreathed in smoke. "You must partake of each course before the final stroke of midnight. It is the only rule. Fail, and the consequences will be permanent." "What are the consequences?" Lyra asked, her voice steady, despite the chill creeping into her bones. The witch's smile widened. "Oh, princess, the answer depends entirely on you. Now, shall we begin?" The first course was a golden soup, its surface rippling with images of distant lands and unknown futures. The witch's eyes gleamed as she ladled it into delicate porcelain bowls. "The broth of visions," she announced. "Drink, and you shall glimpse the threads of fate." Caden hesitated, but Lyra raised the bowl to her lips. The liquid was warm, velvety, and tasted of spices she could not name. Her vision blurred, and then the room dissolved into a kaleidoscope of images. Valenwood's castle, crumbling beneath a storm of fire. Faceless figures reaching for her. And the witch's mansion, consumed by a darkness so absolute it seemed to devour the stars. She gasped, the bowl slipping from her hands and shattering on the floor. The witch clucked her tongue. "Careful, child. Foresight is a fragile gift." "What did you see?" Caden asked, his brow furrowed. "Chaos," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "And an ending." Caden drank hesitantly, his jaw tightening as his own visions overtook him. When he lowered the bowl, his face was ashen. He did not speak. The second course was the crimson tart, its surface glistening as though it had been painted with freshly spilled blood. "The tart of hidden desires," the witch said, sliding it toward them. "Consume it, and you shall know your heart's deepest longing." Lyra hesitated this time, but the witch's expectant gaze left no room for refusal. She bit into the tart, the sweetness giving way to a sharp tang that made her eyes water. Images flooded her mind, of herself not as a princess, but as a traveller, free from duty and expectation, wandering foreign lands beneath uncharted skies. The vision was intoxicating, but it left a bitter taste in her mouth. When the witch turned her gaze to Caden, he shook his head. "I know my heart," he said, his voice firm. "I don't need magic to show me." The witch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How noble! But remember, knowledge unclaimed is power lost." The third course was the silver pastry, its flaky layers shimmering with stardust. "The pastry of regret," the witch murmured. "Consume it, and I shall grant you freedom from your greatest sorrow. But beware, for regret is the thread that binds us to ourselves. Lyra and Caden exchanged a glance. The witch's words hung heavy in the air, a subtle challenge. Caden was the first to take a bite. His eyes closed and a tear slipped down his cheek. When he opened them, he looked lighter, as though a weight he had carried for years had been lifted. Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. "I cannot part with my regrets," she said. "They are a part of who I am." The witch's expression shifted. Was that approval? "Very well," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But the feast is far from over." The clock struck 11 as the witch raised her glass in a silent toast. "You have done well so far, my dear guests. But the true test lies in the final course. Will you taste the stars, or be devoured by them?" Lyra felt a chill settle over her heart. Midnight was drawing near, and the feast's darkest secrets had yet to be revealed. The witch's mansion seemed to warp as the clock ticked toward midnight. The walls stretched and contracted like a living creature, their dark wood groaning in protest. The flickering orbs of light dimmed, casting long twisted shadows that dance across the hall like spectral figures. Lyra and Caden sat at the table, the remnants of the earlier courses before them. The witch observed them with a predatory curiosity, her smoky form now crackling faintly, as if the house itself fed her energy. "You have tasted the beginnings," she said, her voice like the sigh of wind through ancient trees. "But a feast is no mere indulgence. It is a crucible, meant to forge or break those who partake." With a wave of her hand, the next course appeared. The table groaned under the weight of a massive roasted bird, its feathers made of obsidian, and its eyes glowing faintly blue, as though they still burned with life. "This is the fowl of sacrifice," the witch declared. "Carve from it a piece, and it will reveal to you the cost of your most cherished desire. Refuse, and you shall remain blind to the price you pay." Lyra reached for the ceremonial knife, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around its hilt. "What happens if we don't carve it?" she asked, her voice small. The witch's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished ivory. "Then you shall walk into the dark unknowing, and ignorance has a cost all its own." Lyra sliced into the bird's flesh, which yielded with a sound like the tearing of fabric. A piece fell onto her plate, and as she raised it to her lips, the world seemed to blur and tilt. She was no longer in the mansion, but standing atop the castle walls, watching as her kingdom burned. The flames licked hungrily at the stone, consuming the towers, the gates, and the people. At the center of the chaos stood herself, holding a goblet filled with liquid fire. The cost of saving her kingdom, the vision whispered, would be her identity, her past, and her future. To lead was to lose everything that made her who she was. She gasped, dropping the piece of meat, and the vision dissolved. The witch's laughter echoed around her, soft and mocking. A heavy price, is it not? Caden hesitated before carving his own piece. When he consumed it, his knuckles whitened and his breath quickened. Lyra reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his gaze dark and unreadable. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. He did not answer, his jaw tight. The witch leaned forward, her eyes gleaming like embers. "Ah, the prince's truth is his alone, dear Lyra. Do not pry where you are not prepared to tread." The clock struck 11:30. The table cleared itself in a swirl of smoke, leaving only a single dish, a crystal bowl filled with a black liquid that shimmered like the night sky. "The elixir of revelation," the witch whispered. "Drink it, and you shall know the truth of your hearts. But beware, truth is a blade that cuts both ways." Caden reached for the bowl first, his movements deliberate. He drank deeply, and as he set the bowl down, his eyes met Lyra's with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I have always loved you," he said, his voice breaking. "But I fear that love alone cannot save us." Lyra recoiled as though struck. The witch chuckled softly. "Oh, what fragile things the heart weaves." With trembling hands, Lyra lifted the bowl to her lips. The liquid was cold, its taste bitter and sharp. Her vision blurred, and she saw herself walking alone through a desolate landscape. The stars above her flickered and died one by one. She was strong, resolute, but empty. Her heart a hollow shell, her sacrifices leaving no room for anything else. When she returned to the present, tears streamed down her cheeks. "Is there no path where we both survive this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The witch's expression softened, if only slightly. "The feast is a reflection of your soul's choices, princess. Perhaps there is a path, but it is not for me to reveal." As the final moments of the hour slipped away, the witch stood, her presence towering over them. "You have passed the trials of hunger and heart, but the feast is not yet done. The final course awaits, and with it, your fate." The walls of the mansion seemed to close in, the room darkening until only the table remained illuminated. Lyra and Caden exchanged a look, the weight of their shared trials pressing down on them. The witch gestured toward the end of the table, where a goblet filled with liquid starlight shimmered into existence. "The midnight course," she said, her voice low and reverent. "Drink, and your destiny shall be sealed." The clock struck 11:59. The air grew heavy with anticipation as the final trial loomed. The goblet stood at the center of the table, its surface glowing with an inner light that cast soft dancing patterns across the room. The liquid inside shimmered like captured moonlight, swirling in hypnotic patterns as though alive. The witch stood at the head of the table, her shadow stretching impossibly long behind her. "The goblet of eternity," she intoned, her voice resonant, filled with ancient power. Its contents hold the power to rewrite the stars themselves, to bend fate to your will. But such power demands sacrifice. Your most cherished memory, your deepest connection, or your truest self. Lyra's breath caught as the witch's words sank in. She looked to Caden, who sat frozen, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His face was a mask of turmoil, the weight of their trials etched deeply into his features. "We can refuse," he said, his voice rough. "We can leave now. No power is worth this." The witch laughed softly, her voice dripping with amusement. "Oh, my dear prince, there is no leaving now. The stars demand payment. The feast is never refused, only completed." Lyra closed her eyes, the enormity of the choice pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her kingdom hung in the balance. She could not walk away. But the price? What could she lose and still remain herself? "Only one of you need drink," the witch said, circling the table like a predator. "But be warned, the one who drinks will bear the burden alone." Lyra rose from her seat, her legs trembling. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "This is my duty, my kingdom. Our people depend on it." Caden was on his feet in an instant. "No," he said firmly. "You've given enough, Lyra. Let me—" "It's not your burden," she interrupted, her gaze locking with his. "This is my kingdom, my prophecy." Caden's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he would argue. But then he nodded, the fight draining from his shoulders. "If you're certain," he said softly, his voice laced with sorrow. Lyra stepped toward the goblet, the air growing colder with each step. The witch watched, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Ah, a brave soul indeed," she murmured. As Lyra wrapped her fingers around the goblet, the light within it flared brighter, casting the room in a silvery glow. She lifted it to her lips, and the liquid inside seemed to ripple, reflecting memories she hadn't thought of in years. Her first ride through the Valenwood forests, the laughter of her mother, her quiet moments with Caden beneath the stars. The witch's voice cut through the silence. "You will lose what you hold most dear. Speak now, princess, and the goblet shall take what you name." Lyra's throat tightened. What could she give? What could she bear to lose? "My memories," she whispered at last, the words heavy with finality. "Take my memories." The witch's smile widened. "So be it." Lyra tipped the goblet, the liquid cool and sweet as it slid down her throat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world around her blurred, her vision fracturing into 1,000 glittering shards. She felt her memories slipping away, like grains of sand through her fingers. Her childhood faded first, the sound of her mother's lullabies, the warmth of her father's embrace. Then her adolescence, her friendships, her triumphs. Finally, The image of Caden, his hand in hers, dissolved into the void. When the last fragment of her past disappeared, the light from the goblet dimmed and she fell to her knees. Her heart ached with a hollow emptiness, a void where her life had once been. Caden was beside her in an instant, his arms wrapping around her trembling form. "Lyra," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Do you remember me?" She looked at him, her eyes wide and searching. There was a faint flicker of recognition, a shadow of something she could not place. I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "But you feel familiar." The witch clapped her hands, the sound echoing through the room. "Marvelous," she said, her tone exultant. "You have completed the feast, princess. The stars are yours to command, though the cost has been paid." The mansion began to dissolve around them, the walls turning to smoke and the light fading into darkness. The witch's form shimmered, her eyes glinting with a mixture of satisfaction and something almost like pity. "Remember this, princess," she said as her voice grew distant. "The feast is never truly over. It lingers in the choices you make and the paths you take." And then she was gone, leaving Lyra and Caden standing alone in the clearing where the mansion had once been. The forest was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Lyra turned to Caden, her gaze uncertain. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caden took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We find a way forward," he said, "together." Lyra nodded, though the word felt unfamiliar. Together. The dawn was breaking, and with it came the first glimmers of a new beginning. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the forest in hues of silver and gold. The once ominous woods of Eldergloom seemed quieter now, as though the night had exhaled its last breath, leaving the air clear but heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Lyra and Caden stood in the clearing where the witch's mansion had been. The memory of its towering walls and flickering lights already beginning to fade like a dream. The goblet was gone, as was the lingering scent of magic that had suffused the air. All that remained was silence and the soft rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. Lyra touched her temple, her fingers brushing the cold sweat that clung to her skin. Her memories were gone, stolen by the witch's bargain, leaving behind an emptiness that both terrified and freed her. She looked at Caden, his face a mixture of relief and sadness. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. It was not an accusation but a genuine question, her emerald eyes searching his face for something familiar. Caden hesitated, his throat tightening. "I am." He paused, his words catching in his throat. "I am the one who will stand by you no matter what. I am your partner, your protector, and I am the man who loves you." The words rang hollow to Lyra, not because she doubted them, but because they struck no chord of recognition in her heart. She felt as though she was staring at a stranger, one who knew her in ways she could no longer comprehend. "Do you think I made the right choice?" she asked softly, her voice fragile. Caden's gaze faltered. "You saved your kingdom," he said, though the words seemed to pain him. "That has to count for something." As they began the journey back to Valenwood, the forest seemed less menacing, the shadows retreating in the morning light. Yet the path felt longer, as though the weight of the feast lingered behind them, its whispers trailing like echoes. Lyra found herself watching Caden more than she meant to. His movements, his expressions, the way his hand occasionally brushed hers, all of it felt achingly familiar and utterly foreign. She yearned to remember, to fill the void inside her. But the harder she tried, the more elusive the memories became. Caden, for his part, walked in silence. He could feel the distance growing between them, a chasm carved not by choice but by sacrifice. He wanted to tell her about the moments they had shared, the love they had built, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that such truths would be hollow without the memories to anchor them. When they reached the outskirts of Valenwood, the village was stirring to life. Farmers tended to their fields, merchants opened their stalls, and children chased each other through the streets. It was a scene of peace, a stark contrast to the turmoil Lyra had seen in her visions during the feast. But the castle gates loomed ahead, and with them came the weight of her duty. As they approached, the guards straightened, their expressions lighting up with relief. "Princess Lyra, Prince Caden," one of them called. "We feared the worst." Lyra nodded, her expression composed. "We've returned," she said, though the words felt strange on her tongue. Had this truly been her home? She could not remember the echo of her footsteps in the halls, the scent of lavender in her chambers, or the warmth of her people's cheers. All of it was a hollow shell. In the throne room, the council awaited them, their faces a mixture of anticipation and concern. The elder knight Sir Olden stepped forward, his voice grave. "Princess, did you succeed?" Lyra hesitated, glancing at Caden. He gave her a small nod of encouragement, though his eyes were heavy with unspoken words. "Yes," she said finally. "The feast is done. The kingdom is safe." A murmur of relief swept through the room, but Lyra felt no triumph. The cost of their safety was etched deep into her soul, a wound that would not heal. As the council dispersed, leaving her alone with Caden, she turned to him. "I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know who we are." Caden stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You are Lyra," he said, "the woman who stood against the shadows to save her people. And we are whatever we choose to become." That night, as the castle settled into silence, Lyra stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom. The stars above seemed brighter than she remembered. Or perhaps she had never truly noticed them before. The void within her felt vast, but in its emptiness, she sensed the faint stirrings of something new. The witch's words echoed in her mind. The feast is never truly over. It lingers in the choices you make and the paths you take. She did not know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She would face it,